Those of you outside, come on in. All right. Welcome to Speak Up Newport. My name is Ed Sellich, President of Speak Up Newport. First of all, I want to thank the bungalow. They help us out every month by putting on a nice little spread there. So be sure you support the bungalow. They're a local restaurant in Corona Del Mar, very civic-minded. So I'd like to support those kind of businesses in our city. We got a great program tonight. It's on sea level rise and what's going on with different regulations from other agencies, particularly the Coastal Commission, on how we deal with it, protect or manage retreat, different kinds of strategies going on here. And our speaker today is Don Schmitz. Don is the principal and owner of Don Schmitz and Associates. They're a recognized planning firm based up in Malibu. Don has a long history with the Coastal Commission, both as a staffer back earlier in his career, and also he has been representing a wide variety of clients at the Coastal Commission, from private property owners, homeowners, developers, different government agencies. Has had great relations with coastal commissioners and coastal staff, and is one of the preeminent persons in this business that's knowledgeable about dealing with the Coastal Commission and all the things that go on there. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Don and let him take it away. Don?
Thank you, Ed. It's nice to see everybody. Ed left out two of my favorite projects. Things here in the city of Newport Beach, and as I drive past them and look at them, Marina. Sir? Well, I'm not in charge of audio here, but I can project. I've been accused of having a big mouth, so there we go. Marina Park and Sunset Ridge Park were wonderful projects to work on. I must say, for just ball fields, Sunset Ridge Park was truly one of the hardest fights I've had in my 35-year-long plus career. It was incredible. But that's not what you're here to hear about. I own a land use planning firm. It has a very imaginative name, Schmitz & Associates. There's about 20 of us. And we're making a presentation to you tonight on sea level rise. I've been involved with coastal planning and sea level rise issues for a very long period of time. I've been making presentations up and down the state of California to different jurisdictions, including holding sea level rise summits for 3-4 years now. Constructively engaged with the Coastal Commission and other agencies. In fact, there's a table outside Smart Coast, California. I'll tell you a little bit more about them. I've been honored to be their coastal consultant on that, and they have made a tremendous change in regards to silence all your phones immediately. Thank you very much. On the whole paradigm as it pertains to what these regulations are going to be. So, beach erosion in California. Yeah, it's happening, but I'm going to use this as an opportunity to try and deflect something which is very often the starting point when you're having discussions on sea level rise. There's some people that think that it is a very significant problem. There's other people that think it's a hoax. And those folks are very often called science deniers. And I hope to impress upon you tonight, it doesn't matter where on the spectrum you are, because I'm going to illustrate to you that our government in California, in Sacramento, is mandating laws that are going to have significant impacts on the local counties and cities up and down the state of California on their land use planning regulations. So this is a quote from Jack Ainsworth. He was a friend of mine. He was the executive director for the California Coastal Commission. He retired. Dr. Kate Huckelbridge has taken over for him. She's pretty good people too, very competent. And so yes, the concept of us losing our beaches, and this is one of the things that I have tried to impress upon some of the NGOs like Surfrider and certain other environmental groups and the Coastal Commission, is the beach communities care about their beaches every bit as much as they do. That's a hugely important aspect of the communities that we live in. There is scientific evidence that sea level rise is contributing to high tide flooding. There's folks who'll trot out old pictures that show that this flooding has occurred historically, but the science does seem to indicate that we are getting more inundation and we're getting it more often, ostensibly from sea level rise. So the current sea level rise guidance that you really want to be referring to is first the Ocean Protection Council. In their study on sea level rise, they had adopted findings in 2018. They have now upgraded that. I'm going to talk about that in a moment. These projections are hugely important. The Ocean Protection Council is the group that everybody talks to. It's a conglomeration of different governmental and NGO entities. Next, you've got NOAA's technical report on sea level rise from 2022. And then the California Ocean Protection Council Sea Level Rise Guidance of 2024. And the thing that's fascinating about this new study that's coming out and is being formally adopted, it is dramatically reducing the amount of projected sea level rise that we have been operating off of for the last 20 years. So sea level rise projections, how much is it really happening? So you have a couple of lines here, and the laser pointer's not working. That's fantastic. So the top line, as you can see, the critical time period is 2100, about 75 years from now, from the end of the century. And what the Coastal Commission is wanting us to use to date, pursuant to their statewide guidelines for dealing with sea level rise, is the worst case scenario, essentially. That's that top line. And that is 6 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century, in the next 75 years. This is what is still reflected in their statewide guidelines, their interpretive guidelines for residential development, critical infrastructure, et cetera. That's pretty dramatic. I'm going to show you that in a moment. The new studies are dramatically ratcheting it down, which is the good news. So this is a graph which shows the high emissions scenario for the year 2100. So the red line, I'm going to go back to that, which is 3.3 feet, that's the low risk aversion. And then the next line, 4.3 feet, is the medium risk aversion. And then the last one right here of 6.8 feet is the high risk aversion. That's what the Coastal Commission has been requiring the local cities and counties to utilize as the number for their coastal planning. If you take a look at the percentages on the bottom, there's a 99.5% chance that there will not be this amount of sea level rise by the end of the century. There's a 0.5% chance that there will actually be this much sea level rise by the end of the century. That's interesting. And so a number of cities and counties have balked at that and said, wait a minute, this is just not practical land use planning. So we do have some projected sea level rise numbers, excuse me, that we have here. And this is, I've tried to give you some which are relevant as it pertains to there's not one directly here for Newport Beach, but the one you're seeing right here is for Los Angeles and the projected sea level rise. And on the high level, again, they've got the 6.3 feet. This is from the California Ocean Protection Council, the one that I referenced before. The next one is from La Jolla. And again, by using the high or the intermediate high, you're looking at 4.8 to 6.6 feet of sea level rise. But how much sea level rise has actually happened? So this is one of the tidal stations. This is for Newport Beach from 1955 to 1983. There was 2.2 millimeters of sea level rise documented. There is 25.4 millimeters in an inch. So what that means is from that period of time where we have actual scientific data from the monitoring stations out there, there was approximately an inch of sea level rise. So all of the communities up and down the state, pursuant to state law, very often with grants, are doing what are called vulnerability studies. And what it is, it's to take certain levels of sea level rise to show what would be the impacts to those communities based upon a certain amount of sea level rise. So this is Carlsbad. You can see the identified bluff hazard zones and flood hazard zones. And then Oceanside, I could show you these all night, which is not why you're here, because they've been done all up and down the state. So we have Oceanside here, and then Newport Beach. This is where the gasps begin. So this is from NOAA, and this is showing 3 feet of sea level rise, and the darker the water, the deeper the depth of the water that is anticipated to inundate the properties. And so you can see significant portions of the peninsula, Balboa Island are with no remedial measures, under a certain amount of water. The next one is if it reaches 6 feet, which is the planning. And I'm really going to drive this point home tonight. The planning that the Coastal Commission, at least to date, is expecting your community and others to apply regulations on for people to utilize their property. So with 6 feet, we're a bay for all intents and purposes. This is from the Cosmos study, and this shows minimum flooding and maximum flooding. This is with 3.3 feet of sea level rise. And this is with 6 feet of sea level rise. Again, we become a bay. So the city of Newport Beach has done their own coastal vulnerability assessment tidal flood hazard study. Now, unlike other communities, except for a couple notable exceptions, Newport Beach funded this themselves. I'll explain why in a moment, but basically, I'll explain it now. The disposition was that when the Coastal Commission and the state granted money for these studies, there were strings attached to it. I've represented the city of Newport Beach for a long time. I can tell you councils come and go, and there's different staff, but there's a continuous disposition of a real strong sense of independence and that this community sticks together and stands up for itself. I've seen that over and over. And so the city commissioned their vulnerability study and just did it themselves and self-funded it. And you can see the different lines. We'll zoom in on some of these and what they mean. So the red line was with 4.9 feet of sea level rise, and the green line is with less than a foot of sea level rise. And this was done all along the peninsula. This was done in the Bluffs area, and it was done in areas of the bay. There was a table in that. I presume this is a public document that is available, and the city can provide it, that shows how much beach is anticipated to be lost, predicated upon these different levels of sea level rise. Okay, so remember I said it doesn't much matter whether you believe all this or not. If you believe it's solid science or you believe it's a very open question, it's here in the sense that the government is absolutely mandating that we plan for this with all the different coastal communities. So I want to talk to you about a local coastal program. Now, what a local coastal program is, it provides a framework for the cities and counties to apply their regulations. It vests in the local jurisdiction the legal authority to issue their own coastal development permit. So anything within the coastal zone that's development needs a coastal development permit, and the plan is that all these jurisdictions will have their own LCPs, and they have to be reviewed and approved by the City Council and then by the California Coastal Commission. It was my great honor to represent you in 2017 to obtain finally the certification of the local coastal program for the city of Newport Beach. In fact, I'll explain on what the topic was in a little bit, but the last negotiations I had was just minutes before the hearing in this room with the executive director and the senior staff on a couple sticking points, which we got cleaned up, and then we walked in and did our presentations to the commission and got that approved. So Senate Bill 272, which is a bill by Laird, requires all coastal jurisdictions in California to address sea level rise through updated and published local coastal programs by January 1st, 2029. Still feels like it's a ways out. Any of us that have done this type of land use planning knows it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of effort to get these things done, and everybody's not always seeing eye to eye. And remember, it's a partnership. The local jurisdiction has to approve it. It goes up to the Coastal Commission, lots of negotiations with staff, and then the Coastal Commission will take it under advisement. They always have what are called suggested modifications, and then they send it back to the council for final certification. So if you meet that deadline, there will be funding available, state priority funding for that jurisdiction going forward. So I think I actually just inadvertently covered this. This is the sequence of events on how a local coastal program is adopted, a process is adopted. So I'll move on from that. The LCP grant program is money that Sacramento gave to the Coastal Commission. They're anxious to give out that money. They typically raise around $150,000 to $400,000 for different jurisdictions to pay their planners and their scientists to do the coastal vulnerability studies so that they can update the LCPs to address sea level rise hazards. The program's been falling apart. And it's been falling apart because of managed retreat and the implications. Because here's the harsh reality. You have elected officials, council members, supervisors, and they have to answer to their constituents. And if you have a plan which says that 43% of your houses are going to be considered to be underwater, like Del Mar was looking at, you're going to find yourself recalled. And that's exactly what has been happening. There's other significant economic implications for this as well. So they had a number of cities over the last couple of years that spent all this time and money, had all the planning charrettes and community outreach with their professional staff, and generated these local coastal programs with all the scientific studies. They submitted them up to the Coastal Commission. They took one look at the staff report that the Coastal Commission staff created and what the implications would be, and they withdrew it. San Clemente did so. Del Mar did so. Santa Barbara County, very green, progressive county. By the way, I must say, I worked for years to impart to the Coastal Commission just how impressive the environmental credo in consciousnesses of Newport Beach. This community spends a lot of money in regards to water quality, access, and habitat restoration. I think they finally started to get it. But they realized, back to the local coastal programs and sea level rise, that it was falling apart. And other communities just stopped working on it because it was becoming a train wreck. And that is also where the organization I've been honored to work for, Smart Coast California, was formed. Their founding members looked at this and said, hey, nobody's speaking for the property owners, and they're picking off these individual cities one by one. We need a statewide organization, and they formed it, and it's a 501c3. And we've had presentations all up and down the state. We've had sea level rise summits, invited coastal engineers and senior staff from the Coastal Commission, environmental lawyers, property rights lawyers, had these speaking panels, and have made an enormous difference. I believe that the city of Newport Beach is a member of their municipal collective in regards to this, and Smart Coast California maintains a Excel spreadsheet tracking the status of all the local coastal programs as they are wending their way through the system. So what are the strategies to deal with sea level rise? It's not one size fits all, at least it's not now. It was. So what the Coastal Commission and a lot of the very active environmental organizations were enamored with and wanted to see pretty much universally applied is what's called managed retreat. They've tried to rename it. There's been articles in the newspaper and books written because they thought that the optics or the audios of managed retreat just didn't sound very good. But on its face, it makes perfect sense. And that is, if you have existing development and you are going to propose a new home, or if you have a vacant lot and you're going to propose a new home or commercial building, build it back far enough that it will never be in jeopardy from sea level rise or storm wave attack. That's great. However, what about the very significant urban areas up and down the coast where there's no place to retreat to? Where you have a house, they got a beach and a bluff, and they got a street directly back behind them. That's when things get very complicated. And so Smart Coast California has taken a position that managed retreat in certain areas does make sense, but in other areas it ought not to be on the table. We need to look at other solutions. Now, one of the places where managed retreat did make perfect sense is up there in Ventura. And there was a RV park up there and a place for people to park, and it was getting wiped out by storm waves, and they determined that sea level rise was having an impact on it. And so they redesigned everything, and they pulled it back, and they maintained the recreational opportunity. So I want to be clear that managed retreat is not something that is always off the table. So the exhibit you see up here is the hold the line versus managed retreat. So at the top, you can see somebody builds a wall. And on managed retreat, they've got the wall in the house. You have sea level rise in the middle slide there, and it's starting to attack the wall. And on the managed retreat side, they take the wall out. And then on holding the line, they keep the wall, and the beach is gone. Nobody's happy about that, except the citizen whose house isn't washed away. But in managed retreat, the beach comes in, the erosion comes in, the bluff fails, you demolish the house and you move it on back. So the law happens to be a little bit important about this. I'm sure you'll be shocked to hear. And it's not as simplistic as some people would make it out to be. So there's two critical sections. They almost sound like you have dyslexia. They're so close. There's 30235 and 30253 of the Coastal Act. And 30235 of the Coastal Act specifies that if you have existing development, you have a legal right to have a shoreline protection device should your property come under wave attack. 30253 says, for new development, under no circumstances will you design it in such a way that it will ever need a seawall for the lifetime of the project. Simple, right? Yeah, not so much. So you need to harmonize those two sections, and the definition of what is existing development is really the crux of the matter. And there's been different interpretations up and down with the different coastal commission districts in the state of California, but they really have unified their positions in regards to this. But there's an important thing I want you to consider, that even if a local jurisdiction does not amend their local coastal program to address sea level rise to the satisfaction of the Coastal Commission, all of the beach-fronting and bluff-facing development and bay-facing development in the state of California is appealable to the Coastal Commission. So even if you have a certified local coastal program and your local council and planning commission aren't implementing the regulations that the Coastal Commission would like to see, they can and will appeal it up to themselves. And that's happened a couple times in the last year, and they put they being the Coastal Commission, put conditions on it where you waive your rights, you have no future shoreline protection device, you sign a deed restriction that you will remove your house if the improvements become under the public trust doctrine. That means the mean high tide line moves in, or get a lease from the State Lands Commission, and you have to do a mean high tide line survey every 5 years just to document that. So the reality is they're here, and they are very powerful, and local jurisdictions are going to have to work with the Coastal Commission as the lead responsible agency to address sea level rise. So 30235 of the Coastal Act, existing structures, I'm sorry if this gets a little wonkish, but remember, you are legally entitled to a shoreline protection device if you have an existing structure. Now, the Coastal Commission's position from 1977 to 2015, this slide's way too wordy, is that existing means existing. Okay, so if it's there, and you have a house or commercial building and it starts to get undermined, you are legally entitled to a shoreline protection device. And in fact, there was a lawsuit in 2005 where the Surfrider sued the Coastal Commission for issuing a permit for a seawall up in Pismo Beach. And the courts found that the Coastal Commission didn't err, that existing meant existing. Since 2015, it's a whole different animal. The Coastal Commission started taking the position that, well, existing means that it existed when we adopted the Coastal Act and it became law in 1977. Wow. Game changer. Really, really important. And obviously in complete contradiction to the position that they've been taking for decades. And as we talk about this, I think you will see why this was critical to the position that they wanted to have manage retreat up and down the state of California. How do you require manage retreat if you have a whole bunch of property owners that could say, excuse me, I need to put up a seawall, you need to give me a permit? Extremely problematic. So we've been having a lot of conversations, very pointed ones, as you might imagine, and as very often happens in these United States of America, we had some litigation over it. The Casimir Homeowners Association versus California Coastal Commission. And I must tell you, it was very interesting. The Coastal Commission was, commissioners themselves were completely convinced that their position was correct, that existing meant 1977 when the law was passed. Whoops. So with the Casimir Homeowners Association litigation, they sued because they didn't meet the 1977 test, and they said, look, we're existing, we're entitled to a shoreline protection device. I don't expect you to read all of this, but it's a very good ruling for the property owners. The courts determined that the commission's position on this was erroneous. Existing meant existing. It didn't mean 1977. There's a whole other raft of regulations in the Coastal Act itself where existing means, again, just that. That ruling is going up on appeal right now. In fact, I was talking to one of the lead attorneys on the way down here about it, but it's a very good ruling. And where does this all stem from? Well, believe it or not, our legislators up there in Sacramento, sometimes they're extremely thoughtful when they're passing laws. And hey, it does happen. In fact, we have some very good people from right down in this area, I do believe. Article 1, Section 1 of the California Constitution, read it. Memorize it. Possessing and protecting property is an inalienable right. It's in the Constitution. So they are pretty hard-pressed to pass laws and regulations that tell people you can't protect your property. Hence the Coastal Act. There's a certain amount of brilliance in regards to the way it was written. If you have an existing home, you got a legal right to protect it. But don't come forward with poorly planned projects, which is going to require the development of a seawall and ruin the beach. So I'm going to move a little bit quicker on this because I want to leave time for Q&A. But Section 30010 of the Act precludes the Coastal Commission from engaging in any regulatory action which takes private property. And that includes denying a permit which would deny the right to protect the property. So that is where the existing structures is so hugely important. By the way, that's a slightly hair-raising picture. Not exactly what you want to see when you get up in the morning, you come out and you pour your coffee and you go out to take in the view, right? So Section 30010 specifies that there must be compensation for the taking of private property. That's something that's legislated. And here's why so many of these local cities and counties find it so hair-raising the direction that the Coastal Commission was pushing them to do, because you're not immune at the local level. At the local level, you have the power of eminent domain. And so if you adopt a raft of regulations which says you're going to do managed retreat, and if there's nowhere to retreat to, people lose their homes, it can bankrupt the most affluent community. In the last Sea Level Rise Summit, my friend Steve Rosansky spoke on behalf of the Newport Beach Chamber of Commerce, and on the back of the napkin, he came up with a number of billions of dollars for just the houses on the ocean-facing side of the peninsula. Don't know that Newport Beach has that within their budget. So shifting that liability is a hugely important consideration, and that is why the whole program was falling apart. It truly was. Okay, so I'll move quickly on this. There's several types of takings. There's per se taking, there's regulatory takings, there's strict liability from the California Constitution, but suffice it to say, takings have significant implications, although there are rarely clear, bright lines that Supreme Court stare decisis has established. One was the 1995 Lucas case, where they said if you don't let somebody build a house on a legal parcel at all, that's a taking. But it gets a lot more complicated from that. And so the organization that I was just discussing with you, Smart Coast California, has submitted letters in regards to this, specifying that should a local government adopt regulations that, under their LCP, that will result in the taking of private property, they need to have up front a funding mechanism to pay those property owners for their losses in regards to this. It's just fundamental constitutional right and wrong. To their credit, some communities on their draft LCPs are putting things in there which says if any of these regulations result in a taking, then they will be compensated for it. But one of the things that we think is very important is that ought not to be the type of thing that has to happen through litigation in a very complicated process. So then next we have coastal squeeze. I'm going to talk about this very briefly, which basically the way that this is a term that is heard a lot, which is as the beach erodes, if you have a shoreline protection device, and this is scientifically correct. This is what happens. If you do get sea level rise or just an eroding beach, the beach will narrow, it will squeeze the public domain, and the public gets crowded out as far as that goes. And we have had a lot of examples where we're getting a lot of problems. Now, granted, we very often have historically, but it does seem that it is getting worse. And so this is another diagram that shows coastal squeeze. And what has been the problem is when you have individual property owners submitting an application for a shoreline protection device on an ad hoc basis, you get this piecemeal of seawalls, and ultimately you end up with a whole section of the coastline where you have an armored coastline, no beach, and the water's just splashing up against it. And that is not just a nightmare scenario for the general public, for their access requirements and the environment. That's a nightmare for the people that live there. We all want to see big, beautiful beaches. Okay, I'm going to move on past that slide. I'm going to go to this. This is something I created where I call managed retreat can equal sawtooth development. So what I'm illustrating here is the properties on both sides put in a rock revetment because they had a legal right to put in a rock revetment to protect their properties. But the one there in the gap that you see doesn't have one didn't have a legal right because they weren't existing development and they had a deed restriction and they chose not to do it. So this is not exactly what they had in mind when they were talking about managed retreat, where you're going to get this weird jigsaw, buzzsaw type of pattern of development up and down the beach. And this is what happens when you leave it up to just the individual property owners and the government just being reactive to permit applications. So the sea level rise guidance, one of the things that you also need to be aware of, they talk about accommodation, let the water come in, start building the houses up on stilts. But one of the things you need to be cognizant of, and that was one of the conditions that I showed you before, is as that mean high tide line moves in, that's now the government's land. And so there's certain communities that are saying, okay, we'll take out the seawalls, we'll put the houses up on stilts, which has its own aesthetic consideration. And as that mean high tide line moves inland, guess what? Your house is now partially on the public trust doctrine state lands. And so you're going to be having a conversation with the State Lands Commission, and they're either going to be charging you an expensive lease or you're going to be cutting half your house off. And that is exactly what they have conditioned. So I'm looking for a better way. And the better way is a tiered response. And you saw that I was talking about there's a lot of controversy in regards to how much sea level rise we're actually going to experience. and how much and how soon. Oh, and by the way, one of the things that makes this real difficult is when you're talking in amongst yourselves and you're trying to make decisions that will impact you today in regards to how much you can use your property, but you're going to be long dead and gone before it ever becomes an issue, right? That's kind of grating a little bit, okay? But when you're talking about a home with a 75 to 100-year lifespan and worth many multi-millions of dollars, you can see the government's problem in regards to this. It's going to be a train wreck if we do not come up with enlightened policies and regulations to deal with this issue. So the tiered response is, as opposed to, which is what has happened to date, and the Coastal Commission, to their credit, has softened on this, saying, okay, 6 feet of sea level rise, everything that you do, you want to rebuild that house, push it back, so 6 feet of sea level rise. And you remember the vulnerability maps I showed you? Okay. Very draconian steps that have to be taken. Now, the Coastal Commission's idea of tiered response is everything's still the same, but you don't have to do it until we start to manifest that level of sea level rise. I've got a different approach. Smart Coast California has a different approach, which is on a tiered response, have options that the community can come forward with should in fact you get 8 inches of sea level rise, should in fact you get 30 years later you get 1.5 feet of sea level rise. And there's a lot of tools in the toolbox. There's beach nourishment, kelp forests actually make a big difference, living shorelines, artificial reefs and submerged breakwaters, groins, and community seawalls. We have groins here in Newport Beach, as you're very much aware. So the dune restoration, living shorelines, and coastal marsh enhancement is very soft. That's really not for areas where you're getting vigorous wave attack. The kelp forestation, yes, that's a real word. Beach and sand nourishment, and then the artificial reefs. That's hugely important because you can do a lot of beach nourishment, but if you have an eroding beach, it's just going to wash away. There was 300,000 cubic yards of sand deposited 10 years or so ago down at Torrey Pines, and that's a lot of sand, and they had one storm that came in 24 hours and cleared it all out. It was all gone. So having something to keep the sand in place, it's called sediment management, is real important. And then worst case scenario, if nothing else is working and you have a community that says we're not going to go underwater, revetments, breakwaters, groins, harbor channels, and seawalls. So the beach inland shoreline nourishment, you see some photographs here, and it's where you do the living shoreline in particular areas, and you can kind of even reinforce it in the area. So like West Cliff and the Upper Bay would be a good place to be looking at that if the cliffs are getting eroded. Another one that is very imaginative on the living shoreline front is sand dunes are just beach nourishment on steroids, right? You build it up more and you plant plants on it, whatnot, but hey, you get a big storm and it's going to take it out, okay? However, like they did at Cardiff State Beach with their living shoreline project, they basically dug down, created a very long linear revetment, and then they piled up the sand over it in the sand dunes and they planted it with native habitat. It was beautiful and very effective. This is what it looked like before and after, A and B. And this is their living shoreline taken after some very vigorous winter storms in 2022. And you can see that it hit that rocky core and it stopped it. So the whole beach didn't wash away, the dunes and that dune habitat didn't wash away, and then they either come back in and they do another round of beach nourishment in front of it, or you get natural accretion pursuant to longshore transport. Here's one that would not be popular for Newport Beach, I would predict, but it still needs to be discussed, which is the living breakwaters. And this is in Staten Island. This was an award-winning project, and they were just getting hammered back there from storm waves coming in and taking out parts of their town. And so they came up with a living breakwater design. This is a rendering of it in a cross-section. And this is a picture of when they were installing it. And it has a couple of advantages in the sense that it's wonderful for the sea life, not just the pinniped haul out that you're looking here, but everything from the sea urchins and the sea anemones and all the creepy crawlies that we love to go see in the tide pools. They love these kinds of structures. And it breaks the back of the waves. you'll get sea level rise, and you'll still get water that will come in at a higher level. That's one thing, but that's not the same thing as having it on a king tide with 6 or 8 foot tall waves coming in and pounding out your community, and it has been extremely successful. Then there's places where you're going to be talking about seawall and bulkhead and harbor protection. Right here in Newport Beach foreshore. Now this is a picture from Morro Bay, and we weighed in Morro Bay, and Morro Bay said within our commercial core, for those of you who are familiar with Morro Bay, a big part of the community is houses up on the beach to the north, but they've got their core there, they've got their bulkhead, and they said, look, we're not going to do managed retreat or something in here. If we got to build a taller bulkhead, we're going to do it. And for the first time, the Coastal Commission softened on that, and they said, okay. Now, they've always acquiesced to the big industrial ports are not going to do managed retreat, okay? Long Beach and Los Angeles, should they need to, if there's dramatic sea level rise, they'll build bigger bulkheads and revetments and such, and because they ain't going anywhere. So it's the in-betweens, and we're an in-between. Remember the meeting I told you I had with the executive director in here? The last thing we had to work out is on the LCP, they wanted to adopt a policy that said if you got a new house with a 50% remodel, if you have an older house and if you take out more than 50% of the linear walls, it's now a new house. And it must comport with all their LCP regulations. They wanted us to agree that on that house that had the bulkhead facing the bay, we would take out that section of bulkhead. I told him, I said, I have a picture of my PowerPoint presentation I can show or not show. And it's a picture of the little Dutch boy holding his finger in the dike. Okay, you guys remember that? That's ridiculous. That's where you have to have the community approach. And so they saw their light on that and agreed to it. So to finish it up, something I think is probably one of the most powerful tools is artificial reefs to protect the beaches. And this is a narrow neck reef on the Gold Coast of Australia. This was an award-winning project. And it basically, you can see the storm erosion from 1996 before they put the reef in, and it was geotextile bags. And then the reef was installed, and the beach started to accrete. And I don't know if we've got time for this, but I'm going to go ahead and we'll see if it works.
The narrow neck reef is a geotextile bag reef, and its primary objective was coastal protection.
The road across Narrow Neck was built in 1921 by the main roads. It was the Pacific Highway to Sydney. But the trouble is, to miss the river, they pushed it out onto the dune. So it's always been an area that's very narrow. In 1999, my company won the tender for the Northern Gold Coast Beach Protection Strategy, which had a number of elements. The primary one was nourishment, and it was really a repeat of what was done in 1974. We had the new control structure, which was built in 86, which was the Gold Coast Seaway. So what we wanted was another control point just this side of Surfers Paradise. We looked at groins, we looked at beach dewatering, widening the dunes, and the one that came out best was a submerged artificial reef. Without the added bonuses of surfing and diving, it was clearly the best solution. Why a reef? A reef is a coastal engineer's dream in a way, in that you can reduce the wave energy without having to stop all the wave energy, and a reef does that perfectly by breaking the waves and dissipating the energy. We've constructed a structure that you can't see, but it's constantly reducing the sand transport and the storm cut, so we have a wider beach, a more stable beach. So the lifeguards can use the stability inshore of the reef to plant their flags in the best spot. The Australian dredging industry was developed on the Gold Coast. McQuaid won the contract for dropping the sandbags. He had bought in a split-hull hopper barge that he developed specifically for doing this type of work. He hired local Gold Coast boys who understood the surf, and they would actually bring the dredge in between sets, and they would position it exactly right where they'd have someone looking behind them to check when the next wave would be breaking over the stern.
It was a lot of fun building that. It was built on tiers, so the boat would come in, drop a bag, move out. It would then dredge sand up into the bag, and it was filled on board, and then it'd come out and it was dropped out the bottom. It was just a endless job keeping up with the number of bags, and then when it was finished we had to do monitoring to see what was happening both up the beach and down the beach, and to work it all in together the surveyors were very, very busy.
The difference between a geotextile structure and a concrete or rock structure is the type of growth. We get a very soft growth, which is, again, safe for surfers, but it's also better for diving and better for the environment because we get a much more diverse habitat. 10 metres of water, we're getting kelps, we're getting turtles, and I've dived with dolphins. We took one of the top marine biologists in Australia for a swim out there one day, and before he went in the water he said, "It's just going to be another fish attractor, I can tell you that now, Angus." When he came back he said, "You've done it. The geotextile is what makes the difference."
The data that's been collected over the last 10 years from video cameras and other measurements that have been taken at Narranac clearly show that it's been a highly successful device or structure for maintaining the health of the beach in terms of the beach width, and that's been its primary objective.
So the fact that my wife is Australian and has an Australian accent did not influence me at all in regards to choosing that. So trying to move things along here, there are other alternative reef sand retention technologies. These are called reef balls. They look like honeycombs. They're specifically designed to enhance marine habitat. They did studies off of Catalina that showed 200 to 400 pounds of marine biomass grew on one of these per year. This is down in the Grand Dominicus where they installed these reef balls, and you can see the beach before and after the installation. These are below the water level. And I hope you picked up on the down there in Australia that it was the surfers that helped design this. That's one place we get a lot of resistance. Man, hey, bro, don't ruin my surf break, right? But they can actually improve surfing conditions with a properly engineered reef. And so I'm running out of time here. There's other places in California we do not have yet reef examples that they're doing it to protect beaches and communities. They've been done for habitat enhancement and mitigation. However, a very exciting project is now in the works down at Oceanside. That same engineering firm from Australia is designing for them, they're calling it the Artificial Headlands Project, where they're going to build these 2 headlands. They're going to do a beach nourishment project, because south of the pier, their beach is gone. And they just have an unending rock revetment protecting the homes down there. What none of us want. And they're going to do a beach nourishment project, and they're going to build a reef out in front of it so that the sand that they're putting there is going to stay. So this is something that has the potential for Newport Beach. By the way, we dropped colored dots on there. It doesn't mean that's what Newport Beach should do in regards to a reef. It could be in particular areas, but it would be very important for protecting the bluff areas. It would be very important for protecting the peninsula. That coupled with some aggressive beach nourishment and perhaps even some armored dunes. The community can do the planning to protect itself from sea level rise. And then one last closing thought in regards to that. It might not happen, but you can't ignore the Coastal Commission and the laws in Sacramento that they are projecting for it to happen. And this is where you go back to that tiered response. If the city, and obviously one individual property can't do this, you'd have to form geologic hazard abatement districts for the neighborhoods. They'd have to partner up with the city council. They'd have to have this plan to do these sorts of things like they're doing in Oceanside should that amount of sea level rise manifest. So with that, that concludes my presentation, and I'm available for any questions that you may have. but not all at once, please.
I guess I had a question two questions.
Okay, but this gentleman just came up. I'll go back to it. Yes, sir.
Oh, I thought you had to come up here. Yeah.
You do. He's a rule breaker. Everybody knows.
Well, two questions. One is, have you looked at as people become more aware of the reality of sea level rise, what will the economics be? I mean, property values will be affected, insurance rates go through the roof, and so that's going to cause a lot of problems, may even solve some problems. And then the other one is, what is the use of public money to protect private property? I mean, it's one thing to cover, beach areas, but is there how do you do that balance, or is that even an issue at this point?
Well, it is an issue. I'll start with the second question. Most of the private property owners that own a nice beach house or a bluff house, they're not asking the government to come in and take these macro solutions. They will lawyer up, they will hire consultants, they will hire a coastal engineer, they will design a shoreline protection device, they will deepen their footings, and by God, they'll protect their house. And they'll do it on case after case after case until you end up with a whole section of shoreline where you have a wall, no beach, and water slapping up against it. Okay? So this is not a situation where you have the individual property owners looking to, especially, look, guys, there's a very salient aspect to this question. And I hear the Surfrider folks when they're talking about this, that when you have individual property owners, they're going to exercise their rights to build a seawall. They are basically, this is offensive, okay, I'm going to tell you, rich white people that can afford to live on the beach are destroying the public access opportunities for disadvantaged people of color that live inland. And the Coastal Act was amended, by the way, by the legislature for environmental justice. So they have to, by law, take those sorts of things into account. Now, the train wreck was coming when you had the existing laws and you had individual property owners with a constitutional right to protect their property, and this concept of, well, we'll just have managed retreat. Well, no, you won't just have managed retreat. And so we were going to waste untold amounts of money, the lawyers would get rich, and nothing would happen. So I am a strong advocate for private and public partnerships to come up with these macro solutions that will not just protect, and I only showed you a couple of them, there's perch beaches, there's other things, that will protect not only the individual properties, but entire sections of communities. Remember what I told you, Del Mar, 43% of their housing was going to be underwater? It's not going to happen. And protect our precious beaches and recreational opportunities. So you asked me to put this back up here. 52.5 million? That's, proposed is in concept, not to scale. The 52.5 million is an extrapolation from some other project that we worked on. It's this is rude, it's called a wild ass guess, okay? Because a lot of it depends on what type of technology you use. You saw the geotextile reefs down in Australia. It wasn't a long, unbroken line of reef, which has been done in other places, but it was in certain sections, and so the coastal dynamics are very complicated. Yes, sir?
You started by talking about the difference between 2 and maybe 6 feet of sea level rise between now and 2100. And then you moved on to the damage that's being done to our beaches by wave action. One of the things you need to take into account is that if we continue to have global warming, the sea level rise by itself might not be so important as the size of the storms that come in and wipe out our beaches. So the two topics don't actually connect that well. I think you're probably right that even if we got, 6 feet would be a lot, but even if we got 2 or 3 feet of sea level rise, we could probably handle that. But if we get larger storm surges as a result of this global warming, we're going to have a different problem, and it's going to require a different kind of solution.
You're absolutely correct. Now, I only had so much time, and probably took up more than y'all wanted to hear, but that's actually a big part of the conversation. I have to tell you, the Coastal Commission, A lot of people vilify them. They have done a pretty amazing job of being on point and pushing everybody to really study this. So the static water level for sea level rise, that's just where you start. And then you incorporate king tides, and then you incorporate a 100-year storm, and what the wave uprush will be. And a lot of these communities, we are getting that, if you'll pardon the pun, granular. Okay? So we're looking at all those things. In fact, they are even taking a look at what the impacts will be from rising sea level levels, setting aside storm wave and king tides, but what's that do to groundwater? Because now the groundwater coming down's got no place to go, so you got the hydrostatic pressure from the increased sea level rise, and so there's other communities where right now the groundwater is not a problem, but they may not be subject to wave attack, but the sea levels are rising and the groundwater's got no place to go, and all of a sudden you have marshes popping up in places where it was never a problem. Extremely complicated, extremely. You're absolutely right. Sir, I've been instructed you got to come up to the microphone for the TV cameras.
Thank you. My name's Chuck Fancher. You mentioned the city of Newport has a vulnerability study. Was it done in 1917? I forget the exact.
1917. That predates even me.
I'm sorry, 2017. But was it a 2017 vulnerability study that the city funded and did independently? Is that correct?
Newport Beach Vulnerability Study, April 10th, 2019.
2019. How do we determine if it is adequate for today's purposes to use as a starting document, given today's circumstance?
Well, that's a loaded question. How do we determine if it's adequate? That's like me asking my wife if I am adequate. That's probably a multifaceted question. Okay, so I have not gone over it in great detail. I did not assist the city in regards to the generation of this report. However, I have seen the city's work on so many different things. Dave Webb in Public Works is phenomenal. The planning department is phenomenal. So one of these days, in all my spare time between midnight and 2 o'clock in the morning, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to take a hard look at it. But I am sure that the scientific basis for what they did to identify the still water mark for sea level rise is scientifically accurate. But as we just discussed, a lot more goes into it. I've heard, for instance, the Bay. Okay, we just all loved those pictures of Lido Island and Balboa Island underwater, and I know that the city has been doing studies in regards to increasing the height of the bulkhead to protect Balboa Island. Balboa Island is one of the areas that's most at risk because the water comes in. You know, we all think about it like a bathtub, you know? Well, think about it like a bathtub where 3 of your kids are in there and you decide to jump in and do a cannonball. It's very turbulent. And so the water, the tidal surge comes in directly from the bay, and Balboa Island's right there. And so it may look flat, but the water is actually taller facing out towards where you enter into the bay. So they're planning on raising that. I think that their long terms are talking about doing raising other bulkheads on Lido Isle and other places. But look, if we actually get 6 feet of sea level rise, which is statistically highly unlikely, but the city of Newport Beach could even entertain concepts such as a tidal gate. There are options. Yes, sir.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. I have a lot of thoughts, but I think I'll just focus on one of my kind of thoughts on this, and I'm curious if you have any insights. So we're living in a dynamic world, you know, land, there's erosion, there's all these natural processes, beaches, you know, constantly are moving, the bluffs are going to erode and would be creating new space for wetlands if there wouldn't be stopped by property. So we come here and we put these property lines and we put our economic value and kind of put a line on there thinking it's something that's going to stay put. So I'm curious if anybody's high up realize, especially in these sorts of areas that are very dynamic, that are changing, are they introducing concepts like dynamic property, something that doesn't stay stagnant, you know? Because we have these ideas that this is going to stay forever, but it doesn't really make sense. We're not in permanent world, as it is.
I understand your question. And yes, they are. And let me embellish upon that a little bit. Dynamic property. What that means is you don't really own it. You're kind of leasing it. And there can be a scenario whereupon the government sets up a funding mechanism, says, we'll let you stay there, but now you're paying us rent, and when it comes due, you're gone. So let's be clear about something, though. If people weren't here, modern civilization, we wouldn't be having this conversation. You want to talk about sea level rise? When the Pleistocene ended 11,000 years ago, those oceans raised 200 to 300 feet. Now that's sea level rise. The Channel Islands off of Santa Barbara were one giant island. The channel going from Oxnard out to Anacapa was 7 miles, not 11 miles wide. And you could walk out for miles in front of all of these coastal communities. But those of us that lived there back then were hunter-gatherers. And so the ocean came in, you picked up your belongings and you moved in a little bit. Okay, so we're modern day society. We have roads, infrastructure, sewage treatment plants, water treatment plants, beautiful homes, beautiful communities. There will be places where we will do managed retreat. There will be places where we will exercise the almighty tax dollar and exercise eminent domain and clear out certain areas, should we get that amount of sea level rise. There's also places where that's not going to happen. There are communities, and I kind of suspect that this is one of them, where they're going to say, no, we're not negotiable. We're not going to leave. We're going to take steps to protect our community so that we're still here because it's worth it. And this is not a new phenomenon. You ever been to the Netherlands? Gorgeous. And they got all those beautiful iconic windmills, right? You know what those were created for? Back with just wind power and very crude technology? It was to drain those lands which were subject to tidal inundation and flooding constantly, and they turned it into beautiful tulip farm, amazing and farms, and they built an entire civilization on it. But I would agree with you. It's not a one-size-fits-all, but we do have a constitution, both a federal and a state constitution. We do have certain economic realities. Buying out Newport Beach, just this one town, would break the bank for the state of California, and that's just one town. So we're going to have to be practical as well as environmentally sensitive, and I think we can do that. In fact, I think we've got solutions where we can protect these communities and actually enhance the environment and protect our beaches as well. So I really appreciate your question. I do.
Hi, I work in the planning department at the Port of San Diego, so thank you for showcasing some of the things we're working on. My question is about nature-based solutions. What has your experience been with getting the Coastal Commission to approve nature-based solutions? Because I hear that they are resistant to them sometimes.
That's one of those it depends kinds of questions. And you have to understand their regulations and their policies. You know the difference between a policy and a regulation, folks? A regulation is what the legislative body writes and adopts. Your city council, the legislature up in Sacramento. Your policy is how the staff interprets that. And that can change and swing wildly. The coast, and that's why I showed the different districts. Okay, you got San Diego down there, and each office can be a little bit different. But this is, when I started working on this with Smart Coast California, I told them this is not a speedboat that we're going to pivot. This is a giant cargo ship, and it's going to be a slow turn because it's going to go into the rocks with just global managed retreat. And we have to do this not by being enemies with the Coastal Commission, but by being allies with the Coastal Commission, not being enemies with the environmental organizations, but being their allies, and showing why we have to be practical, because we are going to have ports. We are going to have cities and communities. We are. And at the same time, we have to, our precious environment. At the last summit, one of the attorneys for surf writer said, well, you know, I'm probably the only one in the room that really feels strongly that we should be looking at the beaches in regards to this. I said, well, and I'll do it right here. Okay, so who here, by a show of hands, cares deeply about our beaches? Who here, by a show of hands, cares deeply about the environment? And I turned to her and I said, you couldn't be more wrong. And the whole place erupted. And she smiled. And see, we're not enemies. And so it is the messaging, and this is what I do. It's the messaging and the options and what you're coming forward with. We're trying to change hearts and minds here and come up with a new way. And because the program has been floundering at the very top anyways, whether it be Madeline or Kate, Dr. Hucklebridge, and some of the other senior people up there, they're working on it. I've been honored to sit on the working group with the League of Cities and the Association of Counties, along with Erin. She was there, and speaking directly to them. And they are coming forward next month, August, probably, God willing, with their revised coastal working group paper, which is talking about these neighborhood solutions. This is a completely different approach that at the staff level they're starting to embrace, and that's where they're starting to look at things like the reefs, the artificial headlands, things of that nature. So don't despair. And if you want to bounce ideas off me, give me a call and I'll be happy to talk to you about it.
Thank you.
Okay, Ed says one more, and I never argue with Mr. Selich.
Well, hey, Don, thanks for the presentation. Great job. I had a quick question about the video you showed us from Australia. They were talking about the geotextile artificial reefs. I'm wondering how much area those reefs were protecting and how long they took to build.
Good questions. I think they built it in one season with those barges. And because of where they placed it, again, you notice it was a little atypical. It wasn't a long line of a reef, which, by the way, we're just borrowing from nature. Have you seen the atolls down in the South Pacific where you got an island and then there's a coral reef that's ringing it, and the waves never really get to the island, okay? And by the way, the previously mentioned sea level rise and the ice age of a couple hundred feet, those islands were there. The coral reefs were there. The sea levels rose hundreds of feet, and the coral grew up underneath it and continued to protect those islands. We can do the same thing artificially. But in that particular case, it wasn't a barrier all along the shoreline like I showed you for Newport Beach. Okay, they put it in a critical place, separated out a little bit, and that broke the back of the waves from attacking a large section of their prime real estate coastline. Very, very effective. And again, I think they did it in one season.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Don. That was really great. You know, we're really lucky to have Don here. I had a problem getting him scheduled because our meetings occur on the first day of the Coastal Commission. So this happened to be 1 month that he doesn't have to be there Wednesday, but he has to fly to San Rafael to be there tomorrow morning for when the Coastal Commission starts. So, Don, we really appreciate you taking the time, coming down here. Great presentation. Terrific. And Jim wants you to come back and talk about progress in the future. Anyway, that's it for today. We'll see you next month, and have a good evening.